Chapter 3. Buxby, as a junior attorney, could not afford a rooming house equipped with a bath. Therefore, once a week or so, he chose to journey to the What Cheer House at California and Montgomery Streets. This was one of the better hotels, equipped with a public bath in the basement. He enjoyed soaking in the iron tub for an hour, breathing in the steam and the scent of strong soap. He especially enjoyed the experience during cold, damp weather, which could happen at any time of the year in this city. Today, after his soak, he emerged to street level to encounter the Emperor, striding down the street as if with certain purpose. Buxby tipped his hat. Were you where away, your majesty? In a hurry? Joshua stopped and bowed. Not at all, sir. Merely enjoying the day. Of course, I'm inspecting my sidewalks at the same time. I think we could use some new planking along here. Well, sir, if you've nothing urgent in mind, perhaps you would care to accompany me. I'm on my way to a lecture, if I'm not late. Why not? What sort of lecture? It's a lady. Mary Ellen, by name. Perhaps you have heard of her? The name strikes a chord. Lead on, my friend. I am eager always to learn. The lecture hall belonged to the San Francisco chapter of the Workingman's Union. It was not large, and the crowd filled it almost to capacity. Buxby and Joshua took their seats at the rear amid a murmur of discussion. They had not long to wait. A man in laborer's clothes stepped up to the podium and gave a brief introduction. Then Mary Ellen swept in from backstage. A handsome lady. No, a handsome lady, Joshua commented. Buxby nodded, while the crowd fell silent. Mary Ellen launched into a prepared talk about the slavery question and the rights of Negroes. A few minutes into her speech, someone from the audience passed a note to her. She paused, glanced at it, then raised her hand. Friends, she said, ladies and gentlemen, I am told we are honored today by the presence of the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico, His Royal Highness Joshua Norton the First. We are truly blessed. Joshua rose and gave a solemn bow in the lady's direction, among a smattering of giggles and laughter. Mary Ellen raised her hand again as Joshua sat down. Those of you who laugh, she said, you had best think again. Is our emperor any more ridiculous than those who pretend to govern us from Washington? Or for that matter, anyone in this room? She paused a moment until the hall was quiet once more, then returned to her speech. A few of those in the audience turned to give Joshua curious glances, then appeared to forget him as they became caught up in the lady's message. Her speech was impassioned, fiery, and to the point. It was evident she had no patience with subtlety. There were still men in the halls of Congress who would make California a slave state, and she had no patience with them either. When she was finished, there was a standing ovation. When she left the stage, her audience burst into 100 loud arguments. Buxby and Joshua rose to make their departure. A large man with a beard, a roughneck by the look of him, barred their way. He handed Joshua a slip of paper. Dear Emperor, Buxby read over Joshua's shoulder, I should be interested in hearing your viewpoint. Please come to the parlor behind the stage. The bearer of this note will conduct you. I look forward to the pleasure of your visit. Mary Ellen. Buxby grinned and slapped Joshua on the shoulder. You seem to have made an impression with the lady. You go back. I believe I shall go to the monkey block for a quiet drink. He turned and disappeared into the crowd. Joshua followed his burly guide to a side door and through a long corridor to a room at the rear. He found Mary Ellen ensconced on a sofa. She rose to give him a formal curtsy. Your Highness, we have often passed each other in the street, and I have long wanted to meet you. Please sit and have some lemonade. What did you think of my speech? He bowed and sat on the edge of an upholstered chair, tugging at his trousers so as not to have the knees bag. I found it quite inspiring, though I admit there were certain parts I found difficult to understand, never having been in the South, and other parts I found disturbing. Disturbing? She raised an eyebrow, such as, pardon me if I misunderstand. You seem to be calling for military action, for a state of war, that is. She took a sip of her lemonade, then gave him a serious look. My dear Emperor, we have been in a state of war since John Brown was hanged. What I am calling for is more decisive action and better leadership. Some of us pin our hopes on Lincoln, but that remains to be seen. Ah, I must say you are forthright, but it would be a tragedy to break the Union, especially if it means shedding blood. It would be a greater tragedy to allow slavery to continue, she said. Joshua stared at the carpet for a moment. Might I inquire, if I am not too personal, how a lady such as yourself became so involved in this cause? She gave a short laugh, then looked serious again. Oh, I see. You're not familiar with my own history. Tell me, judging by my accent and appearance, where would you guess I am from? Joshua looked her over. He leaned his chin on his walking cane. Well, madam, from your speech, I should guess you hail from the East, perhaps Boston or maybe Philadelphia. You are clearly well educated. Beyond that, I couldn't say. Mary Ellen leaned forward and stared, as if to mesmerize him. My grandfather was governor of the state of Virginia, she said. My father was his son, but my mother was a slave and a voodoo priestess. Joshua nodded, considering these facts. I was fortunate, she said. When my mother died, I was purchased by an abolitionist family from Nantucket. They brought me north and took me into their family and gave me an education. I'm also fortunate I can pass for white. There are thousands of others who are not so lucky. Ah, I see, Joshua said. They conversed a few minutes longer, or rather, Joshua listened while she explained. Then she said she had another engagement. A woman came to tell her a carriage was ready, and Mary Ellen rose to go. Thank you for your advice and counsel, she said. I shall value the friendship of your royal highness. Then she was gone. Joshua went home to think. The Journal of Sarah Althea Hill. The senator drags his feet. He is reluctant to marry. He brings me all manner of excuses rather than a simple ring. I know I shall pin him down sooner or later, but I begin to suspect he may have another woman hidden away somewhere, perhaps in Nevada. Ah, well, there is more than one path to fortune. I am still intrigued by the emperor. Not, good heavens, that I might be inclined to wed him. But I am convinced he conceals a fortune somewhere. No doubt he is biding his time until his creditors become unwary. I think he remains in this city only because he has large amounts of cash nearby. Yesterday, I went to call upon his lady friend Marina at her wretched rooming house. Marina was surprised when her visitor was announced, since few outside the theater knew where she lived. When she came down to the parlor, she was even more taken aback to find the beautiful Sarah waiting. Please forgive me for my sudden appearance, Sarah said. I should have sent a note first, but I'm afraid I'm rather impulsive. This was quite spur of the moment. I hope I am not intruding. Not at all, Marina smiled. I was just resting a bit after my matinee. I have another concert later this evening, but I admit I'm surprised by your visit. May I ask as to the occasion? The landlady brought in a pot of tea and left again without a word. The pot had a small crack in the handle. Sarah gave it an odd glance, but Marina proceeded to pour. Well, I did wish to make your acquaintance, Sarah said. I have had the pleasure of hearing you perform on many occasions, but I must admit I had another motive. I shan't beat about the bush, as they say. It's because you seem to be on such good terms with our emperor. Marina was puzzled. I suppose I am, though I've only spoken to him a few times. What is it exactly that concerns you? Sarah broke out her fan and fluttered it, glancing out the open window. San Francisco weather is so unpredictable, don't you think? Balmy days in winter, cold and damp in the summer. Tell me, do you think the emperor mad? Marina was startled by the question. Mad? I suppose that depends on what you mean. At times he seems quite reasonable. Certainly, he's no danger. No, at least not to others. I will be frank, my dear. I have had occasion to observe Joshua, the emperor, for some time now. I fear for his safety, walking the streets in all sorts of neighborhoods, even Chinatown. A wonder he hasn't been shanghaied. What if someone, for example, should abduct him and force him to reveal where he conceals his fortune? Don't you think he might be better off if he were somewhat, shall I say, restrained? His fortune? Marina blinked. Restrained? I'm not sure I catch your meaning. You say he has a fortune? Sarah opened her handbag, fumbled in it for a few seconds. She had to push under the pistol so as not to reveal it. She took out some printed bills. These bond notes he sells. She passed them to Marina. Were you aware of them? Marina examined them closely. I wonder where he has them printed. Yeah, I know about them, but I have not heard of anyone actually redeeming one. Joshua also prints his own money. I wonder if he is prepared to back his notes with silver or gold. Marina passed them back. Oh, well, Miss Hill, I must admit I'm baffled. Sarah rose, not having touched her tea. I shall leave you to rest, my dear. I'm sorry to have disturbed you. I only called out of concern for our mutual friend, the Emperor. Perhaps I should not have worried you so. You've given me something to think about. She followed Sarah to the door. Perhaps you're right to be concerned. Sarah paused before leaving. I do have an idea. You know, I would do anything to help that poor man. Just suppose you should, shall we say, sound him out regarding where he has his fortune concealed. No doubt it's all in cash to evade the banks and his creditors. Between the two of us, likely we could find a better means of securing his wealth and protecting his person. Don't you think? Joshua's so alone, despite being such a public figure, and I fear a laughing stock. What he needs are true friends, such as ourselves. And she went out the door before Marina could think of a proper response. The Journal of Sarah Althea Hill. A typical theater woman. No doubt she's after His Royal Highness's money. At least now she knows I know. On the other hand, she may actually be so naive she hadn't considered it. In any case, I have stirred the pot. Let's see what bubbles to the surface. Joshua watched the pot boiling in Dr. Luck's office. It was a thick clay pot with a spout, a sort of earthenware tea kettle. The aroma filling the room was heady, almost intoxicating. There was an underlying odor of licorice. We never use metalware to prepare the medicine, Dr. Luck explained. It would change the mixture. He lifted the pot from its charcoal razor, setting it aside. When it cools, you drink 1 cupful, 2 cups a day until it be gone. What will it do for me? It makes you less sad. Joshua got into his heavy uniform coat and picked up his hat. I do seem to be sleeping better. I am happy to help. He got down a glass jar for carrying the mixture. 25 cents for the prescription. Joshua rummaged in his pockets. Dr. Luck, you have aided me greatly. I was thinking perhaps I should bestow a knighthood upon you. How embarrassing. I seem to be about 15 cents short today. Perhaps you would accept one of my personal notes. Dr. Luck waved a hand. You may pay me next time. Never mind the night business. This ain't England. Joshua bowed. You are generous to extend me credit, Doctor. I shall certainly make it up at my next visit. On his way home, with the jar in his large coat pocket, he considered that he'd have to rely on a free soup kitchen for supper today. He'd not had much luck selling bonds to tourists lately, and the better restaurants were beginning to tire of his presence. He didn't much mind the soup kitchens. There was always someone interesting to talk to, sailors from all parts of the world, as well as out-of-work miners and gentlemen like himself down on their luck. Just then he spotted a familiar face on the street, Mr. Bannock of the Bolton. Good evening, sir, he called, catching up with him. Ah, the Emperor! Bannock fell into step with him. Inspecting our public works again? In a manner of speaking, sir. And I assume you are about gathering news, as usual. Bannock laughed. If I would if I could find some. There are plenty of rumors, a lot of muttering in back halls. Some people clam up when they find out I'm a newsman. Have you heard anything good yourself? Joshua shook his head, wondering how he might steer the conversation toward supper. Reading the papers confuses even myself, your ruler. No. Reading the papers confuses even myself, your ruler. There's so much dissension. I have considered issuing a proclamation dissolving the republic. Sorry. Reading the papers confuses even myself, your ruler. There is so much dissension. I have considered issuing a proclamation dissolving the republic. I say, what's all this ahead? They had turned a corner to find a small crowd surrounding a sandlot orator. Taking jobs away from honest working white men, they could hear the speaker expounding. There were 40 or 50 men gathering around, mostly dressed in workingmen's garments. A few women hovered on the outskirts of the crowd. The speaker stood on a wooden box and ranted, I say, we arm ourselves. Let's set fire to Chinatown. Burn the rascals out. He continued in that vein for several minutes. There were a few shouts from the crowd, mostly of approval. Fists were raised and shaken. It was evident the mob was getting worked up. Bannock turned to say something to Joshua, only to find he was no longer there. He looked about and was horrified to see him at the front of the crowd, approaching the orator. Bannock watched while Joshua plucked at the man's sleeve and said something to him in a low tone. The man laughed. Then he spoke to the crowd. Sure, why not? Folks, it seems our Emperor of the U.S. here has something to say. What do you folks think? Should we let him get up here and talk? There were raucous shouts of, let him talk, and let's hear the Emperor. There were also some laughs. The orator got down from his box and Joshua mounted. Bannock watched from the rear with great trepidation. He was afraid to hear what Joshua was about to say. If he spoke out in support of this rabble-rouser, it could result in a riot. If he were to speak against him, he would likely get himself killed. Joshua looked out over the mob for a moment in silence. Then he placed both hands together and bowed his head. He began reciting the Lord's Prayer. Bannock was amazed. Some of his listeners bowed their own heads and began praying with him. When Joshua got to Amen, he began over from the beginning. Bannock stood still and listened. By the third repetition, some of the crowd began to drift away. Joshua continued praying, his voice level and calm. Bannock lost track of how many times he said the prayer. Finally, there was only himself and Joshua left in the sandlot. He walked over to Joshua and reached up to tap his shoulder. You can stop now, Your Royal Highness. They have all gone home. Joshua stopped, lowered his hands, looked around. He got down from the box. He said nothing, but only nodded in satisfaction. This story will make tomorrow's edition, Bannock said. What do you say to a steak dinner? The Lord provides, Joshua said. Marina read about this exploit in the next day's paper. It was on the second page. Most of the first page was taken up with news from the East. Now that the Pony Express was running, it seemed local news was taking a back seat. Marina wasn't sure this was a good thing. She read the story about Joshua in the sandlot 3 times, then cut it carefully from the paper to be placed later in her scrapbook. Marina did not keep a journal or diary because she wasn't much for writing, but she kept clippings that related to her life, mostly reviews and notices of her work in theater. She was feeling these days that Joshua was somehow related to her own life. She decided to go and see him. Sarah also made up her mind to go and see Joshua. What decided her was a message from the detective she'd hired. He wasn't a Pinkerton man. She couldn't quite afford one of those, but he was said to be good. Miss Hill, this fellow you're asking about has been spending a lot of time in Chinatown. He even eats there sometimes, if you can believe it. He's been going to a chink doctor about once a week. I'd wager he has some kind of undercover dealings going on there, where most white men wouldn't even think to look. I'm told this doctor has dealings with one of or more of the local tongs. I'll see what else I can find out. But Miss Hill, if you want me to go much further, you are going to have to come up with some extra hazard pay. I don't want no hatchet in the back of my head. Let me know what you want. Of course, the note wasn't signed. If what this detective fellow said was true, it would make sense. Where better to conceal a fortune than in Chinatown? Even the police didn't go there. It was even possible Norton had converted all his cash to opium. That was always saleable, easily changed back to cash. Yes, she would go talk to the emperor again and ask him to show her Chinatown. Marina got to him first. She had sent him a note inviting him to visit at her rooming house on Saturday afternoon. He showed up exactly on time. After the landlady served tea, she complimented him on his action at the sandlot. You were most courageous, she said. He blinked at her, as if trying to understand what she was talking about. Oh? How so? He asked. In her turn, she stared back at him, thinking he was either brave or a complete madman. But she didn't say that. Instead, she said, You made the papers again, you know. After all that news from the East, they say the telegraph is coming. Soon we'll be getting news from London and Paris almost before it happens. Just think. I was reading a magazine article the other day. It said the telegraph will soon mean the end of newspapers. Everyone will have one in the home. It will print out the news automatically on a paper ribbon. Then there won't be any point in having newspapers, will there? Joshua frowned in thought. I wonder who will publish my proclamations. Marina sipped her tea, trying to think how to broach the real reason for seeing Joshua today. Emperor, Your Highness, I was wondering if you might require some assistance with your personal problems. Which problems would those be, madame? He smiled. Did you hear that the Board of Supervisors has agreed to furnish me with a new uniform? This old one is getting threadbare, unsuitable for your ruler. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah, I did hear that. I think it's wonderful. I'm sure your appearance will be impressive. What I was referring to is the matter of your finances. Ah, perhaps you know of a possible sponsor interested in purchasing some of my bonds. He began digging some papers from an inner pocket. Nah, that's not what I meant. I mean to say, perhaps I overstepped my bounds, but you must believe I speak to you as a friend. I only wonder if you have taken adequate steps to safeguard your financial resources. At his blank look, she added, I mean your money. Oh, that. Well, one does the best one can, but I'm always open to suggestions. I'm sure you understand that in my zeal to govern the empire, well, I sometimes tend to overlook my own interests, but I hope you are not unduly concerned. I realize your problem with creditors, the need to conceal your funds and so on. I was only thinking perhaps if your cash was safe in a bank, possibly under an assumed name. But of course, I don't have much experience in these matters. If you had a good lawyer. Joshua abruptly got to his feet. Madame, I am sure you have my best interests at heart, and I am touched by your concern. But I must tell you, I have little use for the law these days. I truly hope that all the lawyers I shall ever meet are in my past, with the exception, of course, of Mr. Buxby. I thank you for the tea, but I must take my departure before I have overstayed your hospitality. He made a low bow and turned to leave. Marina leaped after him. Oh, Joshua, I mean, Emperor, must you leave so soon? I hope I've not offended you. He took her hand and kissed it. Not in the least, my lady. I look forward to our next conversation. And then he was gone. Buxby dropped by Commercial Street later that week. He asked Joshua if he were planning any new proclamations. Not at the moment, Joshua said. He had been polishing his boots, but put them aside in deference to his guest. The room was filled with the odor of wax and boot black. I am waiting developments, he said. The nation is unstable, as is this city. There is labor unrest. The working men take out their resentments on the Chinese. And of course, there's the Underground Railroad, which the South resents. So many people angry with each other. It's sad the gold rush could not last forever, but there's an end of it. What's fun is fun. What's done is done. No, no, Mr. Buxby. I have no proclamations at this moment that will solve the ills of the nation. I am emperor by the grace of God, but I am not God. I promise to let you know when I think of something. You do not speak at all like a madman, Buxby observed. Would you prefer I did? Buxby pulled a flask from his pocket. Perhaps you would take a bit of heart warmer with me, the finest French cognac, or so I'm told. Joshua frowned. I'm afraid I have not much taste for strong spirits, but perhaps just a drop. Buxby poured into a couple of tiny silver cups and passed one to Joshua. Both men sipped and were silent for a few moments. Did you know that woman Sarah is having you followed? Buxby asked. Joshua raised a brow. Following me? Whatever for? I'm not sure, but it may have something to do with your creditors. She has sent a hireling to our legal offices to inquire about you. From what I hear, she is of the opinion that you may be concealing unreported assets. Of course, I don't believe a word of that, but I'm told she's interested in knowing where you go and whom you see. Joshua laughed. Ha 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 ha. Why didn't she simply ask? I would be happy to show her. I find her a charming lady. I'd be delighted to have her company. She's quite beautiful, but be careful, Your Highness. One doesn't always know what lies behind a lovely face. You don't have concealed assets, do you? Only of the spiritual kind, Joshua said. He tossed off the cognac. Then he added, speaking hypothetically, of course, if I were actually to possess some sort of what you term assets, and were I to inform you of them, well, then, there is your position. I mean to say, you would be honor bound to tell your employers, would you not? Unless, of course, I were to swear you to secrecy. Naturally, if I were to swear an oath, Joshua looked at the ceiling. I should not wish to place you in an untenable position, my friend. On the one hand, you would be bound in honor to inform your employers. On the other, if you swore an oath, you would be bound to betray them. I could not wish such a fate on a friend. Buxby scowled. No, I can see that. I can see why you would not wish to tell me about your hidden assets. Not that I actually have any. I was speaking hypothetically. Buxby, feeling suddenly uncomfortable, arose and took his leave. Outside, the weather was cold and drizzling. Sarah looked out her third-floor window at the rain and mist. The weather reflected her mood. She had just read the latest note from the senator. He had decided to remain in Carson City another week or so due to the press of business. Sarah wondered if perhaps he might be experiencing the press of some other woman's flesh. She would have to get something on him in the event he showed signs of reneging on his various promises. Meanwhile, she needed to keep busy. There was this intriguing affair of the emperor. Surely there was more to the fellow than met the eye. Sarah hated mysteries unless she could unravel them. She was determined to solve this one. She consulted her journal, where she had written down the emperor's home address, provided by her detective. She had dismissed the detective yesterday, since he had about fulfilled his purpose. It seemed he was too timid to make inquiries in Chinatown. Sarah was not timid, especially with a revolver in her handbag. She would go and see Emperor Norton first thing in the morning. The emperor had a sleepless night. He had an intuition of something bad about to happen. He wasn't sure if it would be to him personally or to his empire. In a sense, it was all the same. An injury to his subjects was a blow to himself. When he did doze, he had disturbing dreams he could not remember. He awoke early, determined to take a long walk along the waterfront to clear his head. He was surprised when the landlord knocked on his door to announce a lady to see him. He was more surprised to find Sarah waiting downstairs. She made a low curtsy. Good morning, Your Royal Highness, she said, smiling. Would you do me the honor of taking breakfast with me? At the mention of breakfast, his stomach growled. He made a low bow. I should be delighted, madam. She had a taxi waiting in the street, a one-horse trap. They drove back to her hotel, which had a restaurant on the ground floor. He ordered scrambled eggs. She had oysters. What do you think of the proposal of the chivalrists? She asked. Which proposal? You mean to make California a slave state? No, they have quite given up on that idea. What they want now is to divide the state. Only the southern part will allow slavery. To work the fields and farms, you see? I believe that is a stupid idea, he said. Her expression was non-committal. The truth was, Sarah didn't care one way or the other unless it affected her personal fortunes. She was trying to sound him out, to understand his thinking. Will you issue a royal proclamation on the subject? I may. I shall have to think about it. He was making short work of the eggs. I understand you have certain contacts in Chinatown, she said. Oh, and where did you hear that? She waved a hand. Here and there. You're quite the celebrity, you know. Your public is watching. Your every move is reported in the papers, if not by word of mouth. Probably your breaking fast with me this morning is likely to cause gossip. He gave a sly smile. I should consider such gossip an honor. Tell me, do you mind terribly if I call you Joshua? He glanced around the room. That would be quite all right, as long as we're alone, but not in public, of course. Oh, of course. What I wanted to ask, Joshua, if I'm not being too forward, have you ever considered marriage? Marriage? He gave her a serious look. As a matter of fact, I have thought it might be proper for the emperor to have a consort, but the field of eligible candidates is somewhat limited. I am considering a proposal to Queen Victoria of England. What do you think? She was serious in her turn. Well, that would certainly be an advantageous match for you. But you must be aware she is already married to that Albert fellow. And I must say, she's plain as a mud hen, if you'll forgive me. He studied his empty plate. Yes, there is that. Do you suppose I might have a second helping? He left her about 10 in the morning. She made him promise to show her about Chinatown. Of course, a lady must not go there unaccompanied. He readily agreed and made an appointment for Friday. The rest of their conversation was mostly small talk. Leaving Sarah, he thought she had a puzzled expression, but he couldn't make out why. Outside, the weather was still gloomy and damp, but he didn't mind much. His woolen uniform with the golden epaulets kept him warm, though it did tend to get rumpled. He enjoyed walking in the street, passing the music hall. He felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to discover Marina. He bowed. Such a delight to encounter a charming lady on a beautiful day, he said. She laughed. Have you never seen an ugly You have never seen an ugly day, have you? Come walk with me. I was just finishing a rehearsal. A small part in a play, you know. Nothing much, but it will almost pay my rent. He took her arm and they began to stroll. I shall be sure to catch your performance, he said. By the by, what month is this? Are we in spring, fall, or what? Marina held a gloved hand out to catch the faint drizzle. April showers. This is April. I should have taken my umbrella. Did you really not know what month this is? He shrugged. Sometimes I forget. I lose track. Being emperor takes up so much of my mind. Details like the month or year seem less important. I suppose that's a privilege of rank, now I think about it, not having to keep count of days. There are times when I feel I may never grow older, that I shall remain the same forever. But I know that isn't true. The world changes, I must change with it. Or so they say. By the by, someone was speaking to me recently of marriage. What is your opinion of that institution? Marriage? Perhaps you should ask someone else their thoughts. I was married once, you see. In fact, I still am, far as I know. That experiment was not a success. Ah, I'm so sorry. Don't be. I was quite young. He was a cad, a polished and charming man, but a cad. He was a gambler and a drinker. He ran off with a polished and charming widow with money. I heard they went to Buenos Aires. She was silent a moment, thinking.
Speaking of change, someone at the theater mentioned there's important news from the eastern states today. Have you heard anything?
News? He glanced at her. Good or bad?
Isn't most news bad? That's what makes it news.
So it is. No, I have heard nothing yet today. Suppose we take a slight detour past the office of the Morning Call to see what's up. So they did. The call was around the corner and 2 blocks up. Long before they reached it, they could see a crowd gathered. As usual in this city, it was a mixed group: laborers, miners, a few Chinese, some men in stovepipe hats, ladies with umbrellas. They stood about silently, straining to read the posters at the front of the building. Some newsboys were among the crowd, selling papers as quickly as they could hand them out. Oddly, they were not shouting or hawking headlines. That wasn't necessary today. Emperor Norton pushed his way through the crowd. Most people moved aside in automatic deference to his regal bearing. He reached the front of the building and quickly scanned the nearest poster. Marina was directly behind him, straining to see. What does it say? Norton turned, looking grim. It says Fort Sumter has been fired upon.
Where's that? She asked.